The lecture for April 2026 is the chain reaction in growth dynamics. And to start it off, I wanted to emphasize the point the lecture makes about how we experience life, how we perceive it to be. It's a power that we have that we either are not aware of, or aren't sure about, or pretend doesn't exist. So we pretend to be victims of life and then point at that and say, you see, I don't control things and I don't manage things, and therefore there's no spirituality in life, there's no logic, there's no ethics, etc. What spiritual studies try to instill in us is self-responsibility, and pathwork emphasizes that we create life based on our inner beliefs and expectations. In other words, we see what we want to see. We see what we expect to see based on a template that we are holding. And the key here is holding that template. We see what we decide to see. When there are choices, we make a decision on how to prioritize, what matters, what doesn't, and on how events are interpreted, which is as important as the event itself. And so we can see a landscape and interpret something out of that can be radically different from someone else. Why would that be different? Why wouldn't the interpretation be exactly the same? Because that would be a photograph, and yet the photograph was taken from a different angle if it's taken by another person, and different photographs show different aspects of the same place, item, device, etc. So does our perception, our mind. My mind is made up of very complex things, but basically boils down to my unique essence. I see things differently than other people, and my interpretations are different. Now, they may be different in small ways that I don't bother to emphasize, and therefore people think I see what they see, just because I haven't chosen to explain the nuances and found that their nuances differ. So this is how we can think that we're seeing the same thing and communicate what sounds similar and still be seeing things in a completely different light. And then, of course, there's what we're going to do about it or how we're going to process it, which is also up to us. So there's a great deal going on just in a casual view of a room, casual introduction to a person. There's a great deal going on in the mind of each individual person. So let's bring it back to we experience life as we perceive it to be. Now, the example that I use is when you walk into a room, you may not realize how many assumptions you're making. We don't walk into a room and double check the ceiling or the floor unless we are suspicious that something changed. Normally, we would pass through a room and glance at it just without expectation. And we might pick up on a difference, a new person standing in the room, a new piece of furniture, something having moved. We would pick up on that. But if we don't pick up on something, we just presume it's the way it was when we passed through there an hour beforehand. But if we're afraid that something is different, we will scour the room for evidence that somebody has been there, someone has stolen something, somebody has been in our space. And we might see things that we moved and jump to the conclusion that someone else moved them simply because we don't remember. So again, examples of how our experiences reflect an inner process that's going on. And that's why Patrick is always coming back to what is the inner process, how to understand that. Now, interpretations. We interpret everything without even realizing it. When we interpret based on reality and based on truth, then it will probably not produce pain and suffering, meaning it's not based on negativity or denial of reality, so we won't pretend we don't see the thing that we trip over, and then get angry at the world. However, if we see reality, it may cause some degree of pain and suffering if we have to adjust in ourselves what we expected to see, or if we're communicating with someone who doesn't want to see what we believe we're seeing. So it's not that pain and suffering are completely eliminated, but they tend to be generated by denial or negative thinking or a destructive impulse rather than what is. So our interpretation, for instance, of what love is, if we have a basic belief that love is dangerous, then we will tend to see the dangerous or the aspects of love that seem to hurt our self-image or our desires that go against our self-will, don't give us what we want. That's what we interpret as dangerous. Instead of realizing that love comes and goes, gives and takes, and we have to adjust, we see it as a win-lose situation. If we believe that love is limited, then we're fighting for our slice of the pie. And we want a little bit more just in case. And when we get a little bit less, we're nervous because we could lose altogether. Once again, win-lose by believing that love is limited in the first place. And if we believe that love is given, then we are trying to get it from the other. If we believe that love can only be received, then we make ourselves powerless. I can't do anything but wait for it to come to me. All these are going to affect our interpretations of the world. They're going to affect our interpretations of what is happening. And they're going to, if they're false, they're going to lead to increasingly false and misleading beliefs. Human reality is inherently subjective. It can't be helped. So in all our interactions, it's important to realize that we are filtering what we see and hear, and then we're interpreting everything. It's very difficult. There was a story in the news about microplastics, and it turns out that the scientists who were counting microplastic particles were not aware of how many microscopic plastic particles their laboratory gloves were shedding. So in other words, as they handled the materials that they were counting, their gloves were shedding millions of particles on the samples themselves. They thought it just wasn't in their consciousness, so they weren't aware of it. So they'll have to go back and fix some of their data. This is an example. We may not be aware of our interpretations, but they're still affecting the outcome. They're still affecting how we see and count and understand the situation. And so it boils down to one's life does not lie. That if we are holding false beliefs, we will generate a false reality. We will interpret falsely when, even if reality is what it is, we will interpret it according to a negative belief system, and it will create some degree of pain and suffering. Pain and suffering is an indication something needs to be addressed. Again, I analogize it back to the body. The body is a great metaphor for so many things. If I do something and it hurts, part of the message is don't do that. If I do something and it feels uncomfortable, I may interpret that as painful when it's actually just uncomfortable. Stretching, for instance. But at some point, it may be painful. That's an interpretive line that I have to read into, that I have to learn. I have to learn my body's limitations and learn the difference between stretching to the extent of my capacity and going a little bit further and causing tears in the tissue. The body will tell you what is pain, but pain is a message. It's not necessarily the end of the world to feel pain, but ignoring pain means that the cause could continue and more damage could result. So again, a lot of interpretation going on here. In a recent meeting, I brought up an example of this. I brought up the story of Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Ugly Duckling. And for those who aren't keen on children's stories or never got there, there's a family of ducks, mama duck and all the little ducks, and one duck is different and ugly and clumsy, and their feet are bigger and they don't do as well. And fast forward to the end of the story, spoiler alert, it's not a duck, it's a swan. The egg got mixed up. It's a different being. It had a different developmental arc. It had a different purpose in life, and its body was shaped differently so that it may have been more awkward as a duckling, but it was perhaps more graceful as an adult being. Now, you can take that story and you can put more emphasis on, oh, I'm a swan raised in a family of ducklings. You can invest that with pride. I'm better than. You can also invest that into or change the story, and it's a story of swans, which notoriously grow up to be graceful, and you're the duck. So you look good when you're little, and you never reach the heights that the other siblings reach. You're a duck. The story of the ugly duckling works even if you're a lizard being raised by a family of grizzly bears. It doesn't matter. The idea is that the story is meant to highlight finding our own true selves and honoring our true selves, but it can be interpreted to augment our self-image, to enforce our self-will, or to reinforce our fears that we're not good enough. So notice what you interpret and how you read things, and especially notice how you interpret things differently than another person. I am always fascinated by different interpretations. I'm a movie buff, so I'm very frequently on movie database websites, and I read the reviews of movies that I like or dislike. Wow, the different points of view. And if you want to be an armchair therapist, read reviews of books or art or films or something that you have some knowledge of, and read all the different interpretations of the same thing. And notice where someone may already have been angry before they even started watching the movie or reading the book, where they're using that to put forward a life view that you didn't see in the work of art. It's a way of realizing how much interpretation is brought to the simple process of saying, I liked or didn't like this event, movie, situation, and this is why. So it's a way of seeing the disparity in a somewhat removed way, rather than in your face by your friends in a coffee shop situation, where you can calmly and dispassionately see the differences in how people react, behave, and what they bring to their understanding. It's a hobby of mine. So thank you for listening. This was week 1 of Chain Reaction of Growth Dynamics, Patrick Lecture 179, that we experience life as we perceive it to be. I do hope you read the lecture. The study guides are always, at best, 3/4 of the lecture, at worst, 1/4 to a half of the lectures. So hoping that you go back to the source material. And thanks for listening.